Hello, for this 189th episode of the AS for Architecture podcast, Amica Dall, co-founder of Assemble, writer and researcher, and Francis Northrop, head of Community Economic Power at the New Economics Foundation and a director of Totnes Community Development Society, discuss Common Treasures, Volumes 1 and 2, published by Little Toller Books in 2025, and to which both of them contributed. Common Treasures was founded in 2025 by members of, and collaborators with, Assemble, to explore challenges in rural communities through practical grassroots responses. Its aim is to enable rural communities, and all those concerned in their living, to do better, as communities, networks, commons, and ecologies. The two books document all this through essays, reflections, and photos. What's presented is spatial, programmatic, projective, social, and organisational, and as such, it's designerly. So we talk about some of that.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted today to be talking to my dear friend, Amica Dall, and a new person, Francis Northrop. Thank you for joining me, and Amica, thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking about Common Treasures, Volumes 1 and 2. You can give them their full titles, and the myriad people involved in their publication. It's a bit of a departure for the podcast insofar as it's remorselessly architectural normally, and this is architectural in ways that you're going to explain to me. Spatial, maybe.
Spatial.
But before we do that, Amica and Francis, could you introduce yourselves, please?
Hi, Ambrose. It's really good to join you. I'm Francis Northrop. I work at the New Economics Foundation, where I'm the head of Community Economic Power. And my background is in community-led economic development. And I contributed a chapter to the volume 2 of the series of Common Treasures, alongside my colleague and friend Rob Hopkins.
So how did you get to be involved in this? Just through being contacted by Amica and co?
I've known James and Giles from Assemble for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was through that route that we were invited to take part.
And you're an economist by training?
I am absolutely not an economist by training. No, I'm an economist through lived experience.
Okay. How do you come to the New Economics Foundation? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, genuinely through the lived experience of trying to do community-led economic development where I live in Totnes, which is what the subject of the chapter that we wrote for Common Treasures. So the practice of trying to redevelop a 3.2 hectare derelict dairy site into a mixed-use, community-led mixed-use development.
Was it extraordinarily hard?
It was extraordinarily hard. It was made harder by other people, which I'm sure we might be able to get into, because of the power dynamics around land and money and influence. But also it was singularly one of the most joyful things I've also done, which is a very peculiar sort of combination.
Eudaimonia, it's virtue, isn't it? Hard work equals joy.
I think it was more the people we were doing it with. I would have preferred it to have been easier, to be honest. But I think it was kind of forged in that. Yeah, the relationships were forged through the adversity.
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. Amica, who are you?
Hi, Ambrose. Thank you for inviting us. It's really nice to be here, especially with you, Francis. So my name's Amica Dall. I was a founder of Assemble, where I was for 12 years, and that's where I built up the working relationships with James Binning and Giles Smith, and also Sarah Pereira, who are the co-editors, instigators of the Common Treasures project. Since 2022, I've been working more independently, focusing much more on architecture and design culture, particularly adaptation around ecological and climate breakdown, but also spending time learning a lot more from other contexts and other people about ground up movements, which improve lives, whether profoundly or temporarily. And I've also been working a bit with the incredible architecture practice Material Cultures, who are thoroughly focused on post-carbon construction. Now increasingly focus on building a body of knowledge and practice around the core ideas and common treasures.
So, what are the core ideas? I mean, that's a lovely description, and I would quite like to understand, I suppose, a little bit of the lineage of how you get from assemble into this, and is there a consistent theme? I mean, I could probably explain one.
Do you want to have a go or shall I?
I think you should probably have a go.
Okay. I mean, for me, it's a very strong, intuitive, and quite consistent concern with, yeah, how people are enabled to have more control and input over the conditions that determine their lives and their life outcomes. Particularly, around this question of how good does a decision have to be before it's better than a decision that you make for yourself, a decision made by someone else. And also an interest in the kind of not just the built outcomes, but the social and cultural and economic outcomes and changes from building, from community organizing. I guess it's not really building infrastructures. That's what was what I was going to say, but from organizing communities, putting in infrastructures which do enable them to take control over things. So I've always had that interest in, yeah, ground up organizing and the role that people coming in from the outside, which inevitably I usually am, can have in precipitating that process without over determining or controlling it. And then when you bring that together with, I guess, a mounting concern and focus on issues related to the kind of ethics of the materiality of how we build and sustain construction practices, like increasingly interested in the damage done on, in far off places. We call them, off-site, out of the limit of the drawing, and realizing then you just need a much more expansive approach. And I think architecture is a good tool among that, but I've never really been a designer, and I've always worked with some really talented designers, so I've never really felt like that was a field that would benefit from or require my attention. So it's much more expanded focus, which started initially, I guess, in a renewed interest in where the stuff that we build comes from and the lives and the environments that it's extracted from and travels through and impacts. And I think there is a bit of a blindness in the kind of architecture or design that I was practicing, which was a lot about post-industrial contexts, urban peripheries, and the focus really on the methodology of decision making and the usefulness of what's there. And it had a very strong kind of ethical overtone and political overtone, but actually it had a complete blindness to the communities that weren't the ones that were in the frame that were being affected by those design decisions. So I guess through all of that, and particularly through my work with material cultures, yeah, just an increasing focus on the social and ecological landscapes and trying to think outside of many of the silos that we get trapped in.
Yeah, I was going to come on to this issue around silos, which I think is really interesting. And sort of Common Treasures kind of does that, doesn't it? It seems to be a project that's anti-silo. Could you perhaps explain what it is?
So, what it is for now is a series of books, and those books are predominantly aimed at publishing writing by people who are working on the ground, whether that ground is a disused site in Totnes, like France's, or an agricultural ground. People who are responding in a huge variety of ways to what I see as a set of, I guess, most pressing contemporary issues around resource scarcity, labour conditions, climate and ecological breakdown, but doing it in a very hands-on and positive and proactive way. I think I got briefly involved in working in kind of climate campaigning when I left Assemble, and it's very easy to lapse into despair in that field, or to get buoyed up by a completely irrational optimism based on like the tiny percentage of people that you're talking to every day who are all campaigners and policy people. So I feel like actually the most valuable things that are happening can often be spoken about in isolation. You just hear about this one project, or you hear about that one project there. And what we really wanted to do long term, we obviously haven't achieved it yet, but what we really wanted to do was to give a real sense of the plethora and the variety of work that people are doing out in rural spaces, which is really confronting and responding to, I guess, the most pressing social and um, economic and ecological issues of our time. So absolutely not thinking of the rural as a site of escape, but actually a site of hopeful confrontation with these issues, where they're really also experiencing the consequences, you know, in a way which is different to how you do in an architecture school or as a theorist or a researcher. So yeah, the kind of core ambition was this idea of building a sense of possibility, that you could see a kind of constellation of projects that you might be able to picture yourself in, or kind of find a sense of that you wouldn't be working in isolation if you were to go out on a limb and do it yourself. What we also have a very strong interest in, I think this is expressed in the opening of the books, and it's definitely expressed really clearly in Frances and Rob's essay, is housing somehow still being at the core of this. And housing also is a really interesting lever for change and for economic change and social change. And as a core defining issue of a lot of people's suffering, I guess, in various ways, in terms of, chronic and toxic stress, in terms of overcrowding, in terms of inadequate homes, in terms of not being able to live near where you work or near family. But yeah, it's also, the way that we deliver housing tends to exacerbate all of those issues. But actually, there's nothing intrinsic in housing that means that it should be that way. There's loads of potential to actually use housing as a lever to galvanize regional supply chains, to invest in local economies, to retrain, to build, more available, safe, green jobs. It's just that we're trapped in a highly corporate, highly top-down, highly profit-driven vision of how to produce housing. So yeah, we do still have a really consistent. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you cut that bit out with the dog barking?
People love dogs. I've got a lot of listeners in America. They love a dog.
Love dogs.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll keep the dog in. The
We'll
dog
keep the
stays.
dog in. Well, I love the dog.
I wanted to come back to something you were talking about earlier with regards Common Treasures as a project of connecting, as you used the word you used, a constellation of actors. And we'll come on to this point about scalability, and you've already touched on that. And I liked your introduction there, Amica, because I think you tried to head off every single prompt and question that I sent to you last night in a oneer, undermining my antagonistic line of questioning. But Frances, I wanted to ask a little bit about your work as a community actor and how you felt your work sits within this constellation of other voices within the Common Treasures thing, because I don't know what it's like down in Totnes and doing what you do. My assumption is that on the one hand, there are organizations that you can be part of that can support you in some ways, but also that it feels and is practically quite an isolated process in which people are continuously having to learn the basics of how you do this stuff, how you act towards the common good again and again and again and again. Is that a fair assumption, or is it a more joined up system?
I think that is a fair assumption. Yes. I mean, it isn't that there aren't actors who are trying to link up people who are doing things. Obviously, that's partly the purpose of the book series. But inevitably, it is so under-resourced because it's in opposition to such a juggernaut of like accepted ways of doing any kind of development that it's very hard to push against that norm. And the sort of resourcing for it really has to come from either philanthropic sort of grant giving. Very little comes through the state, which is remarkable, bearing in mind how much public subsidy is given to developers. But that is a reality, and that we have to fight for every sort of scrap of, like there'd be a community-led housing fund and it'd be £20 million. And you think about how much money comes through even like the Brownfield Fund to developers. It's quite an extraordinary disparity. And so people who are doing this work, they're having to, I think somebody referred to it, you're kind of like building the railway track while you're driving the train. So you're having to try and do everything. And there are some incredible people really trying to sort of build solidarity with each other and exchange, sort of ideas about how to do things well, because that's the other part of it, is that you don't want to there's a temptation, I think, to sort of act like the developers, because you need to look like you've got scale. This is partly to your question of scale. You have to look like you can do things to scale to be taken seriously. But actually, the beauty is in the sort of the deepness of the work. So if you're able to work very deeply with people so that you can reconnect them to the land, really, and their kind of relationship with, the development that is inevitably done to them. Particularly rural areas have had insane amounts of terrible house building inflicted upon them. I mean, it's extraordinary. Totnes has changed beyond recognition, and it isn't that you don't welcome the new people who are coming in. It's more the extractive nature of that development means that it's not done very well. It's not done thoughtfully. It's not done with the not the consent of people, but even the involvement of people who already live in the place. And so that was really what we were trying to do with Atmos, with Totnes Community Development Society, was to create that deepness of kind of understanding and connection with development. And so that, to come back to your original question, that is it's the hindrance to people collaborating more, because their energy is going on being very, doing work really intentionally and meaningfully. And without more resource, it's very hard to connect across the pieces as well as do the pieces of work they're doing.
I love this phrase that you use, doing the work really intentionally. I'd like to understand that more, because that's doing a lot of carrying. And I would like to also understand the word land that you used, because Common Treasure seems to me to be about, if it's about anything, it's about connection. God, that sounds so trite, but at the same time, it sounds very important. So this kind of, almost in a way, getting your hands into the ground, getting your hands mucky. Could you speak to those ideas? Like, what is this notion of land that you're talking about? What does that mean as you understand it within your work, but also perhaps within the Common Treasures thing? Sorry.
No. I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the word connection seems trite. It's like we've managed to make things that are the most important things in the world that everybody needs sound like they're like an indulgence, or it's very, very, I hate that. I hate being made to feel like because our work is in the community, it's somehow kind of a little bit, trite, as you say. It's just a reflection.
Sorry.
So, no. But that's how we're but that is how we're kind of, that is how it happens. So you enter these conversations almost as not conversations on podcasts, but conversations with government or with funders, almost as an apologist for not being a big developer who's just like able to get on and do the thing that we need to do because we need to build more houses. That's something else to be explored at another time, I'm sure. Anyway, I think it was really helpful to do the Atmos work in a place where people had relatively recently been very connected to the land, because it's a rural town. So until quite recently, there were market gardens just off the high street. There are farms still around Totnes, the ones that haven't been built on, and people kind of, it's human. It feels like human scale, and it feels very connected to the land in a way that probably cities don't. And so our approach to Atmos was very much around kind of reconnecting people in that way. So the dairy had taken in milk from 50 different farms, and it had been a very, very central kind of important place in the town for that kind of like rural food economy, but also as a place of connection for people. Like, people, they left the comprehensive school opposite. They walked at the end of their schooling, sort of years. They walked across the road. They got a job in the factory. their parents worked there. They met their sibling, they met their sort of wives and husbands there, their partners there. It was very much a place of like grounding for people here. And what we discovered when we first opened up the consultation, we did a really lovely engagement process, which, could talk about more. And people came to that who had purposefully not visited this side of the town before, again, since it closed, because of the pain that it caused them, because it was like a brutal end to this really lovely sort of like connected life that they had with their place and their friends and their family. And so that was really important. And so that concept of land was Dairycrest, who owned the site. For them, they owned that land, but they had nothing to do with it. The people who worked in that factory and who like produced the money for them, it really was their land. But they'd built a social club there, and they kind of on that land. And when it closed, it was just gated off, and suddenly it wasn't their land anymore. And that was part of the narrative, was trying to get that land. We talk about getting the land back, and people say, well, it never belonged to you. It was always, Dairycrest. But it did belong to us, like it's not semantics. It's, it's true. So in that way, the land is about the connection that people have. It's not about the ownership, but it became in the end about who owned it on a piece of paper legally. And that's what messed up the whole thing.
Thank you, Frances. That was a really, really interesting, fascinating discussion. And I would love to understand the process that you have to go through to kind of start working your way back from that point of crisis, a sort of multi-pronged, philosophical, ethical, social, spiritual, practical, territorial crisis. But Amica, perhaps we can come to this idea of, in both volumes 1 and 2, obviously volume 1 perhaps more so, this notion of the small-scale action, of this constellation, of these stars being linked together, is in response to an acceptance that the big mover, the giant policy document, and I put in my notes to you the kind of Kyoto protocolification of sustainability rhetoric, hasn't really operated, hasn't really worked. Is what you're proposing a sort of direct challenge to and counterpoint to that, or is it as a addendum to that?
In terms of my personal motivation and my, experience, it's a counterpoint, but that is, I think, a very different thing to what the work is trying to do practically. So I think that France's experience in Totnes is actually a really one of the clearest examples of why we can't turn our back on policy, and we have to and that there is a really strong and really important role for top-down change to enable small-scale action, right? They can't exist in silos. It's kind of ridiculous to think of small-scale action as an alternative to state-led action. We need the policies in place. We need the frameworks of the financial frameworks in place. We need the laws and the acts in place. So, for example, in France's case in particular, in Scotland, there's a community right to buy, and it works quite well. In England, there's a much weaker version of that, which actually still allows communities to get gazumped by alternative purchasers, right at the very last minute, when they have done, as Totnes Community Builders did, all of the work to demonstrate the viability and build a sense of potential. So in every sense, it requires state level action. It's just, what is that action geared towards? Are all of the things it's trying to do, assuming that all of the actors and levers of change are going to happen at a very high economic level? Or is there an interest and commitment to enabling people at a smaller scale to do the things that they're trying to do? Does that make sense? So I have a little issue with that binary, because I feel like it's more about how those larger systems are geared. So yeah, against maybe, because also I don't think anyone involved in this kind of work would want to stop the COP process, for example. It's a question of, it's not happening fast enough, and it's not enabling us to do what we see needs to be done right here and now. It's so it's a response to the frustration with perhaps the slowness of that process, but not an alternative to it and not a rejection of it.
Francis, when you were working on the Totnes thing, were you cognizant of those bigger superstructural kind of policy ideas? Or on the ground, does it seem very absent that you are kind of working in a vacuum? And I guess what I'm asking is about the reciprocity between large scale and structural knowledges and approaches and policy, and then one's experience of it. Because, Amica, you might be right. Kyoto Protocol, very important. COP process, very important. But at the level at which they're encountered in action by the majority of people, they're absent. You'd never experience them other than on the news, right?
Well, the way that you might experience them is the way that you might get change at a national level, which is partly precipitated by some of the pressures that are created by those big international treaties. But I think predominantly for most people, it's changes in national policy, not international policy, which are going to filter down and have a really, like planning is a really good example of this. Most people doing this kind of work are going to come up against the planning system and its priorities in a pretty hard and brutal way. And that's a really clear example of you hitting up against a set of priorities that have been set at a national level that are filtering then down to a regional and local level that you're then interacting with and often experiencing as very intransigent and very unaligned in practice with what they say they're trying to achieve in principle.
Francis, where did you see the extents of your agency extend to in your work? I guess is one way of reframing that. Like, where did you feel like it was required for a larger scale organization body to take over? What could they do that you couldn't do? Principle of subsidiarity, basically.
Yes. So I suppose we were lucky in Totnes in that Rob Hopkins, who is a co-director, was the founder of the Transition Network. So we were very connected with international sort of climate action. And so that was at the heart of what we were trying to do. It was always about, local materials and sort of renewable energies and minimizing the impact on the environment from the development. And also one of the previous directors had been heavily involved in influencing the Localism Act. And so he really wanted to be able to test the community right to build order, which is what we used, because that was meant to be, as Amica was saying, the crux of like a sort of community right to buy, that if you got the local community to grant planning to a development, then you're much more likely to be able to make it happen, but didn't actually have the end goal that you also, gave you a right to the land as well. So in that way, it was always set in that broader context. We weren't only trying to sort of make something happen here. It was always trying to influence bigger thinking. And where we, I've gone on to work in policy, which is trying to change the rights that communities have. So I would be advocating for, now for communities to go beyond the community right to buy and just for them to have the power to compulsorily purchase land themselves. They could become an acquiring authority, like the councils are. But what we realised was this sort of, we just hit up against this kind of glass ceiling, which was, it wasn't particularly glass, it was just a ceiling, which was you can carry on doing that over there while we carry on working with these developers. We haven't got any, and the planners, even if they'd wanted to kind of help us sort of secure the land, they had no power to do that. And the National Planning Policy Framework really didn't stop all these terrible housing developments pop up around us whilst we were trying to make Atmos happen. So it is that, you basically need the subsidiarity is that the planning authority needs more power. The communities need more power, the planning authorities need more power, and government needs to be like granting those powers through policy, and then also putting resources into it in a way that they don't already. And then other people in different countries have different experiences, but being able to then network across internationally is incredibly important to that too.
So this is going to be a kind of tortuous question, I suppose, but in the face of this kind of complexity above you, or I would say perhaps complexity is a polite way of saying incoherence or intentional obscurity, how do you galvanize the grassroots in practice? Like, what actions do you take to bring the community with you? Even though the community's will is manifest in your existence, still there must be some kind of synergy created to pull them along into this world in which most normal people try and avoid any engagement with government at all because they know it's going to be a nightmare, right? It's an awful, slow, painful and very expensive process. So how do you galvanize? And so the torturous part of this question is like, is there a kind of overarching ethic or philosophical framework which is used to stimulate that desire to move into that process? Because for you, as I'm understanding it, there's a strong ethical component to this, right? There's a strong ethical motivation. Most, everyday people have got stuff to do, right? Their job is to, work elsewhere, and you can't spend that much time thinking about these things. So how do you galvanize the community? What did you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's funny, I did the NEF podcast, and Aisha said a very, very similar, who hosts that, said a very similar thing to me about how do you galvanize people when they've got other things to do. And I think people are interested, but it's the way that you bring them in. And that's what Atmos enabled us to do. So because it was a site that meant something to people, because it had been derelict for 8 years, and, people were concerned about it, they were concerned about the children playing on it, security, safety, but also they could see the potential for it. We embarked upon this sort of engagement process of initially over 6 weeks, where our aim was not just to ask people what they wanted to see on the site, but also to demystify the process of development itself. So it was an iterative learning thing over about 18 months in the end. But we basically acted as if the community were the client, and our architect was excellent, Andrew Kirby, and he understood that the community were the client, and it wasn't a free for all. But we sort of were very clear what the constraints were about the site, the things that couldn't change, things like, the constraint, the physical hard constraints like the railway and the river and that kind of thing. And then we were able to bring in all the different design team members that we needed to kind of unlock what was possible on the site. So we had civil engineers, we had flood risk, kind of experts, we had, obviously ecologists, and the M&E people. And so it became this really lovely iterative process where for 6 weeks people were able to come into the space initially to share just their memories of the site, and whether that was when they worked there or just from kind of the experience of kind of it being in the middle of the town. And then they were able to bring in sort of things that they almost like like mementos. People brought in photographs and things that they'd sort of accumulated over their time. So it became like this really lovely curated front room space, with all these lovely things in it where people shared their memories. And then the bigger room was basically Andrew being there a lot of the time, talking to people about what would be, what they'd really like to see. And in a kind of like, what would you like to see? What would you like to hear? What would it feel like to be here? And then we condensed all that information that we'd collated over 6 weeks down with a community design team over a couple of weekends to get to the start of a master plan that we could then sort of put through the tests of all the different kind of constraints. And it was fascinating. I mean, it was very busy. A lot of the time we were open sort of 3 days a week in this office hub. And on the last day of the first 6 weeks, you couldn't move in there. It was like word had gone round and people were like, oh my God, it's the last day. We all want to get, it was absolutely packed. And there was something very, I think, cathartic for people, but also it's a way of getting collective intelligence and collective kind of aspirations and knowledges together, which didn't privilege anybody. We didn't say, here's Andrew, he's the architect. He's a very humble man. He obviously knows what he's doing. But, he was able to respond. He was able to respond to people in a way that wasn't, oh, well, you can't do that because, he was very much like, that's interesting. And then that's how it kind of continued over 18 months until we got to the final master plan.
It's really interesting. I did ask in my questions the kind of theoretical or philosophical background to all of this. And Amica, maybe you can speak to that a little bit. Like, what have been the stimulating ideas here, if any? I guess for listeners, this is possibly just a nice way in, a way of kind of strewing information.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, I'm a pretty eclectic and avid reader, and not everything that I draw inspiration from will be, evidently very useful to anyone else. But I think there are a few different routes to look at. One is really the writing in agronomy and environmental anthropology, which I think has really turned on its head the dogma which has been in place about what and what isn't viable and sensible ways to manage productive land. So, since the First World War, really, and the establishment of the War Agricultural Office, there's been a real push for bigger is better, which involved, cutting down, being paid to remove ancient hedges. People were threatened to have their land farms removed if they didn't intensify and use, more nitrogen based fertilizers and basically adopt more modern methods. And that's really been the dominant narrative for a long time. And I think what people in that field are doing is really highlighting and articulating the fact that actually 50% of the world's food minimum still comes from very small scale agriculture and unmechanized farms around the world. People like Jan van Pluig, for example, has spent his whole life really working with small scale farmers around the world and done a lot of very rigorous analysis, which is showing not only that land that's managed in a more intensive way is more and agroecological way is more productive. It's actually producing more good quality calories and nutrients per meter squared, but also that it's much more resilient to shock and change because there's lots of different people with lots of different solutions and lots of different crops on a small area of land, which means that as weather, ecology, other things change, you've got a small scale responsive system. I mean, we've also been really inspired by Sébastien Marot, who's always been very interested in the connection between architecture and landscape. There's some really obvious people like Kenneth Frampton, critical regionalism. I mean, personally, Eleanor Ostrom and her emphasis on governance rather than access and ownership, not necessarily like, we look at campaigns like Right to Roam, it's all about a kind of either you're allowed on it or you're not. In Eleanor Ostrom, what we get is this understanding that governance is at the core. So land might be in private ownership. We may or may not agree with that. The way it's the kind of people and the kind of economies within which land gets subsumed. But the core thing she's saying is the thing that is transformational is how the land's governed, whether it's public, private, or held in common. And the thing which makes resources renewable and regenerative is governance and agreements about how things are governed.
Yes, and Ostrom's lovely work is a hopeful thesis in the face of Garrett Hardin and others' idea that, left to their own devices, ordinary people will screw everything up. And I think that's at the heart of the common treasures thing, this notion of the hope that the common and collective voice articulates.
Yeah, but there's still, I think, a really strong respect for knowledge and expertise in the sense that just because you've got access to just because you're not, part of an international agrarian conglomerate, it doesn't mean that everything that you would do if you got access to land would be good for it, right? So there's still a real respect for and value it, and like real strong value put on people who have that built up know-how, whether it is very practical and hands-on or whether it's acquired through more abstract means of study, but a belief that people have the capacity to acquire that knowledge and the ability to deploy it sensibly and ambitiously, and not an unthinking priority given to those who happen to have particular kinds of authority or power now. So yeah, I think it's just a slightly subtle thing. I think there are some problematic arguments going round in certain circles, which sort of assume that if you've got access to something, you'll automatically become a good guardian for it because you'll love it. And I think that does overlook the reality that in order to be a good guardian of something, you need to know it and to understand it and to care for it over time. I think that it's complex a little bit what I'm saying because I'm, I guess, trying to capture questions around access to land and the right to land, and also the kind of knowledge and know-how that Francis is describing people having about their town and what it needs. I would say those people already have that inbuilt knowledge that is useful in that context. The question is not always just about how people access land, but how they're enabled to build a relationship with it, come to understand it. But yeah, I think it is profoundly hopeful, and that is why I'm interested in it, because it is a bulwark a little bit against despair, which is where you can end up when you are working at a very high level on these questions. But I don't think it's naive. I don't think you have to believe that, there'll suddenly be will rebuild the entire economy around these principles. Even if one or two areas are able to establish revived ecosystems, more resilient local ownership, that will be better, and that will be more resilient to climate shock, to social shock, to economic shock. So I think you can find hope in just the small action of one group or around one place. You can obviously hold a hopefulness that there'll be many more places, but it has that kind of a nuance, I think, in it.
I like that. I want to finish on this one last question, which I want to put to Francis, because you've had this experience of working with an architect, and it comes off the back of what Amica's been saying, this idea of expert knowledge or specialist knowledge and its deployment in this process. Charles Holland did a post today or yesterday on social media about how there's a sort of challenge to the idea of the designer, and that what architecture schools do is they teach people how to be really good designers, in theory. But I quite like this idea. How does a community group like your own use an architect? And how does an architect work in relation to a community group like yours? How does that relationship of knowledge and expertise manifest? And I guess maybe is this indicative of a good way forward for architects working in this sort of space?
I mean, I would say yes. My experience has been with Andrew and also with Unit 38, who are an architecture design agency in London, because I'm also involved in the community plan for the Wards Corner building, which is the Seven Sisters Market in Haringey, which is a similar kind of, there's a community of traders and local people who want to redevelop a building. And I would say that, I mean, personally, I can't imagine what it's like to train for so many years to do something, and I really admire that. So I think being an architect is an incredible achievement just on its own. But I would imagine that being able to work with the community in this way would be far more enriching than working with a developer, because you get to flex so much more of your practice. But it does take a very particular kind of person to be able to do that. You have to know when to, I suppose I said this, but you need to know when to, like, front load your knowledge and when to be able to step back and not sort of say, I've got the answer to this, but be listening all the time. So it's almost like it's using your skill in a way that is really enabling. And I think people really, the way that Andrew held the process at Atmos felt like we were being held. Like we didn't feel like a group of residents who didn't really understand development. He enabled us to understand development. He curated the design team with us. He enabled us to see what putting together a master plan looked like and involved us at every step of the way. And so that is a very specialist role to play, but it's incredibly valuable because the end product that you get is something that you really can point to. I mean, I'm sure lots of people who build, tall buildings are like, well, that's my legacy. But actually, for me, a legacy would be somewhere where you really embedded knowledge about development in a place. And it led to a really beautiful development. And I know that I'm sure the people who have actually done that, because it didn't happen here, I'm sure they would speak to that. Yeah.
Do you reckon, Amica?
Yeah, it's complex because not all architects do know about development, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what we're trained in is what they're trained in, I should say, sorry,
Yeah,
is the
careful.
get a letter from Reba. What they're trained in is the to create instructions for the construction of a building. That's what the core training's around, at least sort of. You acquire that understanding about how development works in practice if you're able to work in a certain kind of practice and you have a certain kind of curious mind. I think that a lot of the kind of knowledge that an architect in that position holds can feel very it can feel very arcane. There's all these words and processes and um, fluency in that or sort of comfort among them can be incredibly enabling in a community context. Like a project, for example, that happened while I was at Assemble, though I wasn't involved in it, was the 10 houses on Cairn Street for the Four Streets Community Land Trust, Granby Four Streets. And a lot of Lewis, who lived there and was really holding that project, he often described his role as kind of putting what the community already knew into a format that was acceptable for the council and for the funders. So it was about kind of giving a kind of authority, which is, I think, more embedded in architectural language, graphically and actual language. To ideas that already have their own validity and clarity. But an architect also, I think, can, in the best circumstances, bring examples of places where things have been possible or happened, or like someone's actually tried to solve that question before of how to share laundry facilities, at the very basic, through to someone's tried to solve that problem. Here's the person that worked out the financial model, or here's a document about how they did that. And I do think that's one reason why small scale projects getting realized, even if they take extraordinary effort from loads and loads of people, is really important. It's an argument which is horrendously overused in architecture discourse. It's a prototype. It's a prototype. It's like, for what? Often, for what you can do with a massive public art budget, or for what you can do if you've got 35 students working for you for free. But an actual prototype, like I think Atmos is, and Atmos would have been even more had those barriers to it getting built not been there, or those disenabling bits of policy. If you can turn around and say, look, these people have done it, then I think, building those connections and capacities is something that it is beyond a traditional architectural skill set, but it's certainly something that I think someone like Andrew Kirby, for example, exemplifies of trying to build that sense of possibility. And it's the justification for doing this kind of work when it feels irrationally difficult. That once it's done, it's a proof of concept, and it gives a lot of kind of hope and clarity. I feel like I definitely went off rails a bit there in terms of answering your question.
No, I like it. I like it. Thank you ever so much. I think that's a great point to finish on.
Thanks, Ambrose. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you, Francis.
Yeah, thank you. Good to meet you.
In the clean air, folds of all the gullied green hills around the town are sharp. Breath stings. Beneath the roofs of frosty houses, lovers part, from tangle warm of gentle bodies underquilt, and crack the icy water to the face and wake and feed the children and grandchildren that they love. That's from Kyoto, March, by Gary Snyder, and it's a bit alright. Pertinent. Thank you to Amica and Francis for speaking with me, for the PDFs of the books too. See the podcast description for links to them at Little Toller's website, and to Amica, Francis, Assemble, the New Economics Foundation, and the Totnes Community Development Society online and on social media. And thanks for listening.